if you don't know what's going on in the system, if you don't have the data, then the data is the core initiator to understand and make actionable impact, to understand what's going on, and then be able to make actionable impact. So what we do is we collect the data, but we also create strategies for how how these companies and governments can decarbonize.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of CleanTechies, the podcast. This is episode 37, and on today's episode, we have a conversation with Tara Gupta, who is the CEO and founder of MacMap Collective. MacMap Collective is a carbon footprint tracking company that makes data available to the public in order to help consumers make choices about the businesses that they're supporting. So a very interesting conversation with Tara. She is also, by the way, a Forbes 30 Under 30 inductee for 2022. So a really interesting conversation with her. I hope you enjoy the show. Before we do get into it, want to, of course, make mention to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition and recruitment across the climate tech, renewables, ESG, and technology spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you are personally looking to make a career change, please do consider reaching out to NextWave. You can do that a couple different ways. You can reach out to them on their website at next-wavepartners.com. You can also reach out to one of their consultants directly by finding a consultant in your region and in your specialty within their LinkedIn page, which is, again, Next Wave Partners. So without any further delay, let's get into the show.
All right. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm very, very good. Glad to have you on. Super excited to be able to speak with you today and learn a little bit about some things I'm obviously not super technically inclined or know a lot about, being a non-technical person. So I guess for the audience, why not just give us an introduction about yourself, maybe some of your accomplishments. I know you have some pretty recent accomplishments that are pretty exciting too. So feel free to share kind of your background and how you got to where you are.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for having me on. And so basically, just to give you an introduction to my company, MacMap Collective, we are a carbon tracking and supply chain transparency platform. So we really focus on creating a system and data visualization around the carbon accounting space to make sure that this is a really clear process, and also that there is clear communication once those goals are set and about how they're achieved for companies, for governments, and for individuals. So really a multi-sector approach. My background is in design. I come from a design school called the Rhode Island School of Design, and I have gone on and done my MBA after that, or am in the process of completing my MBA at Georgetown. And I really admire the ways that you can apply the arts to business and to sustainability in order to motivate people, inspire people, really promote a hope narrative that allows us to change things. Because I think a lot of us are seeing huge natural disasters in the media and getting really overwhelmed with what's happening. So our goal is really to empower and to contextualize the complex climate science in a way that's easy for everyone to understand.
Mm-hmm. And so could you talk us a little bit about how exactly did you get here? Like, what was the impetus for you to get involved in the climate tech space? I'm always curious to understand that kind of evolution for that journey.
Yeah, of course. Really transparently. So I have personal health issues and chronic disease, and looking at that or learning about that myself and understanding how, sorry about that, understanding how the larger system works for the body made me really understand, okay, this is how, or maybe sort of jump to the climate science aspect in terms of thinking of it as a system, as a body. And so for me, systems design became really interesting, looking at urban systems, looking at global systems and biological systems, ecological systems. So that's really what happened, where MacMap Collective sort of was birthed. It was really thinking, okay, why are we all mapping our carbon footprints in isolation? If we're just mapping against ourselves, then all we can do is get to net zero or get to decarbonization. But if we're mapping against each other, then we can really look at the planetary boundaries. We can look at the global picture. And then we aren't just getting to net zero. We're not just stopping the problem. We're actually positively impacting the world in a way that we are working collectively to create abundance, to create whatever world we want to create.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit more about, I guess, just kind of educate us a little bit. This is something I'm not super knowledgeable about. is just the history, I guess you could say, of carbon footprint tracking and the other data that you guys track, and kind of what you mentioned that people have been tracking individually. So I'm kind of curious to hear how that came about, and now kind of what we're shifting to now with making it, as you say, a collective.
Sure. Yeah. So basically, what system we've been using for the past 20 years or so, that was developed, I believe, in 2001 by the World Resources Institute, which is a major nonprofit actually based in DC, where we are as well. But they developed the system of life cycle analysis, which is the main system used for both product-based sustainability as well as organizational sustainability. So when you hear a lot of companies talking about, okay, I'm mapping my carbon footprint, this is our scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions profile. That is really the basis of life cycle analysis. And so when they're talking about that, they're really indicating that, yes, we are using the life cycle analysis process to pursue a map of our own carbon footprint. That is not 100% accurate, but it's sort of the best system we've got right now. Hopefully we will, as everyone in the sustainability world is becoming more active, then eventually we will innovate, and either the World Resources Institute will put out another version, or another organization will put out another version, perhaps us as well. So a lot of what we are doing right now is we're using that system, but we are, instead of just applying it to the product level or just the organizational level, what we're doing is we're networking all the different lifecycle analysis profiles of all these different organizations. And then when you talk about scope 3 emissions, so there's scope 1 emissions are direct emissions, scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions, so purchased fuels, such as like electricity that you purchase from the grid. And scope 3 is all about the partnerships you have. So if you're an organization, then if you're CVS and you're working to buy a bunch of supplies from all these different vendors that you're hosting in your store, then all of those partnerships will be your scope 3 emissions. So a certain percentage of their emissions are accounted for in your budget as well, or in your emissions profile under the life cycle analysis system. So a lot of that network comes into play when we're looking at, okay, that global system, we should actually be mapping this. We should, instead of perhaps just CVS doing it and then just the vendor doing it. Usually a vendor who's smaller, or these smaller to mid-sized companies, have trouble mapping the carbon footprint because they see it as a costly, daunting task. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of different softwares coming out on the marketplace that are targeted at that. We're even discussing partnerships with some of these softwares. But for the approach that we're taking is more of that big picture approach. It's more of that networking approach, saying, okay, let's simplify this. As we all go along and map this, let's simplify this whole process and make sure we have somewhat of a social, like almost a metaverse map of the carbon footprint.
Okay, so I guess one thing I'm curious about, I've had people on here that are in the ESG data tracking space. Is what MacMap Collective is doing? Are you just focused on carbon emissions, or are there other data points that you're tracking as well?
Yeah, so we have both what is called the carbon plan, as well as what is called the supply chain plan. So we have these two programs, which are part software, part services, that are supportive programs that we take companies through. We take governments through the carbon plan as well. And these focus mostly on the carbon plan. We focus on all sorts of emissions from the carbon plan. From carbon emissions to what is called carbon dioxide equivalents. So that is basically a profile of all different emissions, but including methane, including all these other greenhouse gases. But what we do is we convert them into carbon dioxide equivalents, just because people really understand carbon as a metric and are able to talk about that socially. So we're accounting for the whole profile in our work, actually. But the way that we're calculating that and storing that and communicating that will be in terms of carbon dioxide equivalents. So that's how we're mapping the footprint on the carbon side.
Okay. And then, so I guess I'm kind of curious, I think there could be, some people might argue, why spend all this effort on tracking things? Why don't we just reduce and focus our efforts there? Because obviously companies and infrastructure has to be built around this, but I'm just kind of curious, could you speak about what can be accomplished once we have this information and once we're tracking it, especially across a very wide, essentially the whole world?
Yeah, so going back to the health analogy. So if you don't know what's going on in the system, if you don't have the data, then the data is the core initiator to understand and make actionable impact, to understand what's going on, and then be able to make actionable impact. So what we do is we collect the data, but we also create strategies for how they can how these companies and governments can decarbonize. So we act as an implementation partner with them, and we will keep analyzing, okay, these are the best ways you can create these strategies. What is going to be the ROI on those different aspects as well? What are you going to really be achieving here? What kind of reduction? So we're looking at different versions of the ROI. We're looking at the financial ROI, and we're also looking at the ecological ROI. And so when we're doing that, we're really making sure that we are able to help with that whole process, and we're analyzing the data, which will allow us to also track, okay, what we're doing over that process is actually making this type of impact. We're getting to decarbonize, we're getting to this 0 point, this idea of zero. But that's not just a net zero for us. We're actually decarbonizing the inherent operations of the business. So we're not focusing companies on this net zero concept as much. We want them to stay away from offsets, but then bring in easements and offsets that are verified and are actually worthwhile at the right time. And that would not mean in that early stage where they need to actually change their activities. So the data is important and is actually essential. Otherwise, you're just operating blindly. It's like going into a surgery without having any idea what's going on in a patient.
Okay, and then so I got a couple things. When you mentioned the offsets, right? Making sure that they're verified. Is that something that your platform as well will help verify? Hey, if you are going to purchase carbon offsets, here are the best ones to purchase.
Yeah, so we're actually going to go through that process. We have a network of partners for a variety of different things that are
Mhm.
offshoot aspects of this program and the needs that our clients have. And so in our network, the advantage of taking a networked approach is that we can continue to we can develop these relationships with all these different partners, especially in the offset space. We can track the progress of them. We can map their carbon footprint, their impact as well, how negative they are, and what those carbon offsets also really mean, what kind of ecological impact they're having. So when we're taking this planetary boundary or is it planetary focus and approach, then we're looking at the global carbon sinks. We're looking at the ocean. We're looking at all these different large scale factors that maybe aren't usually taken into account when you're not looking at a map version, when you're only looking at the LCA of your company alone.
Mhm. Okay, and then so what is the process? I think this is an objection a lot of I've heard from people is the process of tracking this information. So could you talk about what does it look like for, say, let's give us two examples, maybe a small business and then a larger business to track this data and to upload it to your platform. How do they get set up initially, and how do they maintain to ensure that the data is still up to date?
Yeah, so initially they get set up through, we're going through different versions of our platform. So we are actually, we're developing better and better technology as we
Mhm.
grow. So right now we have version 1 out and we're releasing version 2. Right now what they do is they will have a input series of questions, but we will also be integrating as we grow this year. We're hoping to integrate more direct polls, so direct API integration and direct automation of that process in order to cut out as much as we can cut out as much labor as we can from that process. But right now, a lot of it is that the data collection is a big barrier for a lot of companies, and so what we do is we try to make that as seamless as possible. Either if they don't have a data collection system in place already, what we'll do is we will organize a task force and we'll make sure that, okay, if we still need to build that system for how that company is going to input data, then what we do is like there's the personnel behind it, and then there's also the technology behind it. So we put all of those pieces together, and we make sure that we have a smooth process going forward.
Okay, got it. So I would assume then the process is going to be varied quite starkly from smaller companies to larger companies, correct?
It's a little varied, yeah. So we do have a questionnaire, and that's more suitable for smaller companies, I would say. For larger
Hmm.
companies, there are so many pieces that
Yeah.
that won't really be comprehensive, and so there's different aspects. Like there's more of integrations, more of technology aspects, that type of thing.
What if, since there's a consulting piece to it, I'd be kind of curious to hear your experience with, especially in larger organizations, as they implement this tracking. How hard is it, or what's kind of the process look like to get buy-in from everybody in the organization to ensure that kind of not only is the data being tracked, but that the mentality is being adopted, that we're trying to kind of shift to this carbon negative future?
Yeah. Usually, if on the company side, or I guess both on the company and government side, the main barrier will be how viable they feel it is on the financial side. So we will actually have financial projections often that we're including in that, or like, okay, what is the impact on whatever operations you're doing? What does this actually mean for you as a company, as a government? Because governments also have to think, okay, we're allocating resources to this. How do we where are we procuring that? What are we what are our trade-offs here? And then a company has to take those same decisions into account in a different way. What are our investors demanding? ESG, are they is the, like, CEOs are being switched out nowadays because they're not following sustainability. So right now we're seeing a lot of interest from the leadership. Sometimes there's pushback from a chief like a chief financial officer or something like that, but usually everyone will be on board and want the project to happen. It's just whether or not it can fly with the whole team at large.
Mhm.
And it might be just that there's a slight delay in how it actually proceeds, and then everything is smooth sailing from there. But I think a lot of organizations are surprisingly much more interested than maybe the assumption is. There's a huge CSR and sustainability push right now, which it's great to see because you see cohesion within a company.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I've noticed that too. That does seem to be kind of it. If anything, maybe company didn't. It's just they're creating some type of product that may kind of have no positive or at least obviously positive benefit. So being able to be a sustainable company can really give people some kind of unity in what they're doing. That's interesting. Um, I'm kind of curious. You talk about the financial side of things. In terms of the economics, are there direct or at least capturable economic benefits to implementing this tracking of this data? I know with some of the companies I've spoken to here, when it comes to finding out what's going on, it allows you then opportunities to reduce costs in operations and stuff like that. Are there any direct ways that most of your clients are able to reduce costs of their overall operations through this work?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, one, just to give you an example, the most obvious one that actually reduces millions and millions of dollars for a lot of companies is just that they can switch out from any outdated type of lighting system they have, if they're using tungsten or something like that, to, or even fluorescent, to LEDs. And that cuts a huge amount from their purchased electricity bill. So that already, they're using less electricity, they're much more efficient, and they have an immediate switch to a more sustainable alternative. So that's one example. And just from that, you can kind of get an idea of how different scenarios play out. A lot of the other examples are a lot more freeform, or they're still being proven out, but that's one that has been proven out in a really strong way. So a lot of the other tools we're using there's also different debt ratings that you can get that are more attractive than if
Mhm.
you're a large company that uses debt. So, I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can actually make a huge return on the cost of the programs that we offer. And so we try to encourage companies, hey, look at the fact that, you could potentially sometimes make 60x returns on
Mhm.
the work we do. And so it's really a no-brainer for us. But also making that case, or helping people to understand that can be a process.
Yeah, I can imagine there's a bit of education that has to go into it. You know, not everybody is aware of these things, right? They're focused on running their companies and they may not be thinking about it. So that's fair. Um, I guess I'm kind of curious. This is something that this topic is just generally speaking always been extremely interesting to me within the entire space, is the idea of transparency behind all this data. I obviously have some of my thoughts of my own, but I'm curious to just hear your thoughts in general. on the importance of transparency throughout the climate tech transition, whether that be individuals, organizations, or governments. Could you maybe just talk a little bit about that? Maybe some of the benefits beyond simply just reducing carbon footprint.
Yeah, so I think that it's clearer than ever when you look at COP26 and the way that Gen Z in particular is responding to greenwashing. I'm sure you've heard of greenwashing. It's basically just the problem that results from lack of transparency. And so it's clearer than ever that we need accurate data that is verifiable, that people can see what process is being used, how it's like there are trusted organizations like MacMap Collective that can actually show that information in the clearest way possible. And it is centralized in a way. And so that all of those are important factors in creating a reliable transparency system. And those are the ones that we are implementing. Otherwise, a brand can really just say whatever, especially if they're doing internal tracking. That's why it's also important to have a third party doing it. A brand obviously will have different motivations. And so even if they are the most genuine brand ever and they're doing great work and they just want to promote it, consumer might still feel like, okay, well, this is the brand saying we're great. So
yeah, show us what you're talking about, show us the money kind of thing. That makes sense. I guess, what about, I'm kind of curious what your take is on, maybe there's some examples of this being done already, but in terms of regulation or at least very strict guidelines that governments kind of promote to help different organizations start tracking these things and get it moving, because I would assume that in order to really, really have this work very well, we're going to need as much adoption of this tracking globally as possible. So I guess a couple questions here. A, do you see any bills or regulation coming down the pipeline within the US to kind of promote this tracking of this? Are there any examples in the past or with other governments that are doing some things like this, and what have the consequences been, and how has it worked? And then I guess generally, what are your thoughts on the government getting involved in regulation? Because obviously sometimes regulation has adverse effects that were not intended.
Yeah. So I think to just start off on the question of, is there activity in the space? Is there regulation in the space? You see actually a lot of states and a lot of companies are being regulated, and that's actually very effective because, for example, if they're considering, okay, well, this is unnecessary, for example, an energy company that needs to make this shift from oil to more renewables, then they may not consider that to be an urgent concern. But if the regulation is coming down the pipeline, all of a sudden, then they start to look into it, and then they're turning their attention to that, and they're willing to make the investment. And that's going to benefit them in the end, because it's going to stabilize the energy provider. These major energy providers are going to be stabilized for all of us. And for economic reasons, as well as for ecological reasons, that benefits all of us. So I really do believe in that type of regulation. For states and regional governments and local governments, you see that type of regulation coming into play as well. And there's a lot that are taking action. A lot actually are taking action just because they see, sea level rises right in front of us. We're on the coast. Let's actually take action right now. Let's try to set aside some budget. But the regulation allows for more room for those states and cities to set more budget aside and to start actually pursuing these things. So the regulation makes room for that. Makes room for that investment that actually then, even though that can be controversial for taxpayers, that actually ends up helping us overall because of what I'm saying on the returns front, right? Like, we actually model out the financials for the city as well, because we're really looking at, okay, how is this going to impact your city as a whole? We want to make sure that you guys are stabilized and you find ways that you can contribute to the city positively through this plan in ways that are not just ecological, but are also socio-economical, because that's what you're relying on your government for. So really making sure that we are taking a holistic approach to that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then any examples, do you know of any examples specifically where governments have done this kind of pretty successfully throughout the globe?
There are different ways that each government is approaching it. I would say it varies also on the type of government.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of regulation has happened in some of the European countries, and that's sort of how they've spun that out. And it's been successful because they then have, as a result, been slightly ahead of the curve when it comes to also the energy transition, as opposed to the
Mm-hmm.
U.S. The U.S. is starting to get there in terms of the regulation, but I know a lot of it's very controversial still within the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's sort of a here or there in terms of how we're going about that. But I think that a lot of these multinational corporations also then they're impacted by some of their European partners, and so they start thinking about it because of that, and then perhaps they bring that also to their U.S. operations once the U.S. has implemented that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of countries even uh, more centralized governments, such as in the UAE and in the GCC, they're also looking more at okay, how do we make this transition, because we've made our wealth off of oil, and now oil won't be the primary source of energy anymore. So they're actually, interestingly enough, really ahead of the curve, just because they've been focused on energy so much as a
Mm-hmm.
source of wealth. So I mean, there's some interesting ways that it's being tackled for sure.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And obviously, there is a lot of. I think you can probably compare quite easily Canada and the U.S. Right? Canada seems to be a bit more ahead of these things and has taken a pretty active approach, from what I can tell, on trying to use this not because it's needed, but also because it is an advantage to their country, right? If they can get ahead of climate technologies in general. So I find this very interesting, and just kind of how geopolitically it will play out in the world, and kind of it will kind of help certain countries probably will be lifted into a new level from these technologies. So I think it's interesting. I guess I'm kind of curious, given that this is a very large undertaking to try to map as much of this as possible, what have been some of the biggest challenges throughout your journey with this?
Yeah, so I guess building our software out fast enough, just because the problem was so urgent. Also applying the types of frameworks that we are trying to apply for this. We there's just a lot of controversial dialogue, and you can get stuck in what my my mom likes to call analysis paralysis, where you're just stuck in this cerebral loop where you're analyzing, and then you're critiquing, and if you're not necessarily taking that into an actionable plan, then you're not actually able to execute. So a lot of the scientific community is talking about a lot of these frameworks, and it's great dialogue, and we're trying to use all that great critique that's happening, um, except we're also trying to implement, and so we have to kind of be careful when we're balancing those different factors, and making sure that we're keeping up to date on all the different scientific critiques, but at the same time using that in order to implement this planetary approach that is really unique and innovative.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think just generally the idea of whether it's ideas or technology, right? When one becomes mass adopted and then you have to change it out. I think it's funny. I was in the airport the other day, and I forget which airport it was, but they had every place had, you could order, right? You could order for your food and it would be brought there. And I forget what it was, but there was one thing that just seemed like it was about 5 years old, right? And when they built that, they probably thought, this is great, we're at the leading edge. And then, now they probably regret that, because if they wanted to swap it all out and be up to date again, it'd be quite a lot of money. But just generally speaking, I find this interesting, especially in this problem, because we obviously need to solve this problem quickly, and we need to use what solutions we have. We can't wait for silver bullets. So anyways, just to comment on that. I'm kind of curious, broadly speaking, to understand what your outlook is on the macro for the data tracking of all of these different things, whether it be simply carbon emissions, ESG data in general. What do you see happening over the next, let's say, 4 to 5 years with the space?
Yeah, so I think that it's set to just explode. It already is starting to explode in terms of the fact that so many companies, so many different governments, like everybody needs to track this, because if we're not tracking it, then we have no idea. And we're actually, so we're at about 217 parts per million in the atmosphere. And the limit that IPCC has suggested is 2 degrees is 450. So that gives you an idea of how close we are to that limit. And it's really a matter of if we can track that, then we can actually look at this in a very numerical way, and we can start to incrementally get our stats down, just like when you're looking at the scale and it's keeping you honest, and you're not like, oh, okay, I've gained 5 pounds, I better be careful. You actually start to get it down when you have the numbers in front of you. So I think that it's really a matter of all these different organizations being a little bit collaborative, because the task ahead is so daunting and so important. And so that's the approach we're taking as well. It's really a collaborative approach, forming a lot of partnerships, and that way helping achieve this global scale.
What are, I guess this is something I'm curious about too, is I'm assuming it's not necessarily easy to define and answer the question, but are there a lot of efforts that you guys are making right now to find other IoT device companies that are tracking some of this types of data, just kind of around, whether it be, I don't know exactly some applications, but maybe they have access to tracking these data, but are they going to have the opportunity to just be able to duplicate what they're already tracking and put it into your system to help create this full picture?
Yeah, so we actually are partnering with some organizations like that, or we're looking to, and there's a lot of different organizations that are attempting that. And so some are more are further along than others, and some are focused on different sectors. And so we basically plan to act as that hub that helps connect all this data up and visualize it in order to mobilize it.
Got it. I guess, and maybe to kind of close things up a little bit here, I'd be curious if you could talk, for people who aren't super familiar with the idea, because you mentioned in the beginning, it's beyond just getting to zero. We want to get to kind of this regenerative economy. A lot of people call it the circular economy. Could you talk a little bit about that and what the benefit to businesses could be, whether those are existing solutions or potential in the future, or at least just the idea of how it can work?
Yeah, of course. So when you mentioned circular economy, what we're really talking about is looking at supply chains and figuring out the end-to-end, that beginning to end life cycle of all the materials involved. And so when we say circular, we mean that that's not starting out from a forest and ending up in a landfill, but really that is starting out in, it could even be like the starting product could be anything. It could be repurposed wood from somewhere else. It could be, and then it can be put into a circular loop where either there's a biodegradable aspect where then that is going back into whatever forest is producing the wood, or you have other elements like technological components and metals and stuff like that, which will be 100% recycled and then put into the circular loop as well. So this is part of the solution as well in terms of figuring out how do we deal with all the materials that we're using, and what is the rate of using those materials? How do we decarbonize those activities along the way? So that's why we integrate a supply chain program with the carbon program, to make sure that we are able to actually keep track of this sort of monster of supply chains that we're dealing with right now. And that way we can also focus on other aspects. We can make them more agile. We can avoid blockages like the ones we're seeing right now. And there's a lot of different elements to this that come into play in overall creating stability and sustainability for the world.
I think that would be interesting to see as more and more data is collected here on the supply chain side of things, what might be some possibly commonly overlooked areas for improvement. Like, I think if you can say, hey, wow, we found out we're expending so much carbon on this one part of supply chain or this material, maybe we'll get some scientists on that to reinvent that quick, please. So that'll be interesting to see. And then maybe one final thing, unless you have any other thoughts, is what would you recommend for young people, especially people maybe just kind of going into university or graduating from high school, looking to be part of this change and to help create a kind of a better future for us? What are some of the best recommendations you have in terms of getting into the space, mentalities to take, Maybe if they're entrepreneurs, what advice you have there, just kind of generally speaking.
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of ways to self-educate yourself, and there's a lot of material out there. This is honestly even though sustainability has been around for decades, this is a very Gen Z millennial moment. So it's really, but at any age, it's really something you can do nowadays to just get yourself into the world through education, through watching documentaries, through reading scientific articles and scientific journals online, and understanding what are the different discussions going on about this. And so I would suggest, really educate yourself on it, and then start to think about how you face different problems in your life, and how you might be interested also in seeing a difference. And so that's really where these entrepreneurial ideas come from, your own frustrations.
Mhm. Maybe one last thing I'm just kind of curious to hear your take on is, in terms of the education sector, right? Like, if you want to be, typical path is to finish high school, go into university, maybe 4 to 6 years, and then get into your career. Obviously, we all know that the issue we face is a very time intensive issue, right? Like, we can't just wait around. So for people who really just want to get started, do you anticipate any really change in kind of the way maybe companies look at potential employees, right? Maybe we'll take people who just have bare knowledge but have a super interest, and just help get people into the workforce to solve these problems sooner. Do you have any thoughts, generally speaking, on what that might end up being in the coming years?
Yeah, so I actually dropped out of my undergrad because I felt that urgency. But I went back, and I dropped out of my MBA as well, just because MacMap Collective got so busy, but I'm planning on going back. And so I
Mhm.
do believe in actually completing the degree and really making sure that you can get that certification. I've hired people who have great credentials, and I know that they can execute because of that. And they need that base level in order to work with us. So I am, I mean, if you want to be somebody who drops out and starts the entrepreneurial company, if you feel like you have the network for it, then I mean, by all means, go for it. This is a
Mhm.
fluid world, but at the same time, I really think that it gives you an advantage. And what you don't really think about when you're starting a company is that it takes a while to get off the ground. And so ideally, if you're in school, that's the ideal place to be, because you can, prioritize starting your company. You lower your class load, and then you start working on your company immediately. And as you get into it, you'll realize, oh, thank God I didn't drop out of school, because it's taken me 9 months to just even get the idea together, let alone the revenue, let
Mhm.
alone make revenue positive. So when you are going through all those stages, it's great to go, if you're like a sophomore in college or something like that, it's great to go through all those stages while you still are on student loans or something like that, where you have minimal income, but at the same time, you do have something to go off of. And you can
Mhm.
still pitch to people. It's not like you are prohibited from that just because you're in
Mhm.
school. Just reorganize your life, and that will teach you the right skills also for multitasking and managing your life properly when you do go into that entrepreneurial role eventually. But if you're not in an entrepreneurial role and you're just if you're, I mean, not just, if you're like, I really, like, I rely on my team so heavily, and that's why I'm saying, credential yourself up if you're actually going to go into environmental practice. Because if you are not an orator, like Greta Thunberg, who's like, yeah, she doesn't have credentials, but she has a network, and she has great speaking skills. She's more of an entrepreneur. But if you're not creating this different type of mentality, or different unique type of career, then it's really essential. The world is not going away. I don't believe so, because we're working hard to make sure that we're that we're stabilized. But every generation has its crisis, and that urgency you feel. I mean, there's always going to be solutions and ways to jump into the work and ways to innovate when you're coming out of your college. Like, it's
Mhm.
not going away. And so I think that urgency is just a factor of youth, but it also is a motivator that you are able to harness in order to actually get yourself started, get yourself going and excited, and use that really creative period of your life to generate ideas.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I feel that it's possible that while in university and working on something like this, kind of applying yourself, it would help to focus what you're learning about, right? I've talked to a lot of young people kind of in the other things I do about this uncertainty of what to do with their life, especially at an early stage. And they sometimes just say, oh, yeah, I'm going to go to college. I don't know what I'm going to do. But they try to figure it out, and maybe they figure it out after they start working. So I feel like that's good advice, I think, for everybody listening, what you just said, to focus on doing something if you really want to, and while you're in university, because you have a little bit of flexibility. Maybe you have to reschedule things a little bit, but that might also help you figure out what your passion is and help you to understand like what is the area I should be focusing on. Maybe switch a few classes as you go along to ensure a good outcome. But very good. Thank you so much for coming on today. Really appreciate you taking the time. Any closing thoughts that you wanted to offer?
I mean, just since we were already going on the education thing, I guess like if you need to drop out, flounder a bit. I think that in any situation in life, in any stage in life, it's good to flounder a bit. Because then it really gets you into a harsh reality, or into a way that you're like, oh wow, this is what it is.
Mm,
And so if you need to have that experience and kind of get shook up, then you can have that experience just entering into entrepreneurship too. I'm sure like a lot of the founders you talk to, they've had that some sort of experience like that, where, entering into entrepreneurship, it's a really daunting task. You're starting something, you don't know if where it's going to go. Sometimes you only have 3 months of runway, and you have to then raise some money, or you have to find a client real fast. So I think that that's all part of the journey. And it's a important way to learn how to be flexible. But
mm.
thank you so much. I really appreciate coming on the show, and thanks for asking great questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for coming on. It's been a pleasure, and we'll definitely keep in touch to see how things go and have you on again in the future. But until next time, we'll see you then.
Awesome.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining on today's conversation with Tara. Really hope you enjoyed it. If you do have any thoughts or comments, please do let us know. You can reach me on Twitter or reach me in the Slack channel. If you'd like to continue hearing more of these conversations, and this is potentially your first time here, please do subscribe and turn on notifications for the future. And of course, as always, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, we really do appreciate rating and a review, which really does help us to drive engagement and to get the word out there to help spread more awareness about climate technologies. So please do that. As always, you can also share this episode with people directly who you think might find it interesting. You can subscribe to the newsletter, which comes out the 27th of every month, discussing one topic. My friend Randy and myself help produce that. And then, of course, we recommend connecting with our guests on LinkedIn. So connect with Tara on LinkedIn and reach out to her to learn more about MacMap Collective. You can check out their website as well, a link in the description. And as always, you can reach me with any questions you have on Twitter or through Slack as well. So quick shout out for next week. Next week, we will be hearing from Martin, who is the president and founder of Heliyne, which is a US-based solar manufacturing plant. So we discuss primarily supply chain issues. I wanted to get this one out as quickly as possible, given this is a big topic of discussion right now. So thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of CleanTechies, the podcast, and we will see you next week.